Greetings, everybody. Welcome to Community Conversations with members of the Jewish American Heritage and Asian American Pacific Islander communities. May is both Jewish American Heritage Month and Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And we are excited to be hosting this conversation in collaboration with Jewish American Heritage Month organizers and the Weitzman National Museum of American Jewish History. The Community Conversation series is a place to connect, to be curious, and to share the stories and histories that shape America. Together, America 250, our speakers and the public come together to explore the themes important to our country. And community conversations will be held regularly through 2026 to reach and engage with Americans across the United States and our friends around the world. My name is Megan Springate. I am the Director of Public Outreach and Engagement here at America 250, and I will be co-moderating this session with Michael Glickman, founder and CEO of JAHM. Michael, please like to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Megan. Pleasure to be here. So I'm the former director and CEO of the Holocaust Museum of New York, which is the Museum of Jewish Heritage, and also the former director of the Center for Jewish History. We are working with the Weitzman National Museum of American Jewish History in organizing and coordinating the convening of Jewish American Heritage Month. And so we are delighted to be here. So thank you.
Thanks, Michael. I've got a little bit of housekeeping just before we start. This conversation is being recorded and will be available on the America 250 website and on YouTube soon after we're done. Please use the Q&A or chat function to ask questions or make comments to the panel. We'll be monitoring those, and we'll be raising some of those comments and questions up to the panel to address as time permits. If you would like to turn on the closed captioning function, you can see the little CC box on the bottom of your screen. And a reminder to everyone that America 250 and these conversations are nonpartisan. And finally, a shout out to Stephanie, Mari, Maria, Dan, and Kara for keeping everything running smoothly behind the scenes. And thank you also to our ASL interpreters for joining us. Okay. Before we meet our panelists, we'll have some welcoming remarks from Joe Daniels, America 250's president and CEO, also Mr. Frank Giordano, and then a video from Rabbi Mira Rivera. Joe?
Thanks so much, Megan. I just wanted to say a few words first to express my gratitude for so many people who are joining us here today. It's really important for me to express, and I know you're going to hear just a short word from the Executive Director of the U.S. Semi-Quincentennial Commission, Frank Giordano, after me. But one of the things I just wanted to stress is that the importance of these conversations really can't be overstated. They are, of course, valuable in and of themselves, that we're in this month that that Megan just talked about, which is so important to the Asian and Pacific Islander community and the Jewish community. But even more important than that, we are deep in the phase of this project where we're putting together all of the programs that are going to add up to this really historically unprecedented and I think special semi-quincentennial that's not so far around the corner. So these kinds of conversations, the perspective that we learn, what we hear is important from these conversations will have a direct impact on our programming. And that's not something we just are going to say, but we are looking forward to coming back to these groups, these conversations, these panelists later to show how our programming was influenced from the discussion. So I wanted to say that. I also wanted to say I think Michael and I have definitely met before. I was the founding CEO of the National September 11th Memorial and Museum in New York, and I'm particularly pleased with our panelists today. There's a lot of great Americans that are in locales around this country that are represented, but I'm really pleased to have New York front and center here today. I like to think about New York's role in the semi-quincentennial in a twofold way, and I think our panelists really embody that, which is one, of course, it is incredibly historic, and our founding as a nation, so much of those early mechanics, Philadelphia, of course, was central to it, but when you look at Federal Hall and some of the other areas down in Lower Manhattan, New York plays a really important role. in addition to that, 250 years after our founding, I like to think about New York as one of the best examples, if not the best example in our country about one of our top tier themes of this semi-quincentennial, which is celebrating the true richness of our diversity. Looking around New York, riding the subway, you just can't help but feel privileged to be exposed to what it really means 250 years after our founding, just to say, I'm an American. And it's just really great. And the institutions represented here today, I've had many wonderful moments with my family at the Tenement Museum. It's a wonderful place for folks who haven't gone there. Please go. Dr. Polland, I'll take my cut of the ticket sales later. And I also want to say that the Museum of Chinese in America is one of the special crown jewels in New York City. It's both a beautiful building itself, a beautiful facility, and then the visitor experience itself is off the charts. I also feel really grateful to have Congressman Meng be a part of this. We can't overstate how much gratitude we feel to have you participate in today's discussion, but as we build out the America 250 caucus, we're already up to, I think, just about 80 members. That's going to continue to grow, and we want our caucus to reflect America itself. So it's a real pleasure that you're here. So with that, I'm going to just turn it over to Frank. Frank, I really appreciate you speaking here today, and I just want to say, as the CEO of the America 250 Foundation, who started 6 months ago, so much of the work that we're able to do now, the communities that we're able to interact with, the partners that we're able to activate, is due to just the tremendous and the very hard work of the commission since its founding in 2019 under Frank's leadership. Frank, take it away.
Thank you, Joe. Appreciate it very much. Congresswoman Meng, the rest of the staff, the panelists, everyone who is in on this Zoom, I can't tell you how much we appreciate this. We envisioned this, really. We started out in an office in DC in the basement of a building with 4 people. And we were talking about how we need to reach each and every American, how this commemoration has to be about all of America and each and every American. And we need to listen, and we need to set all this up. And I sat there shaking my head, yeah, but didn't know how we were going to do it. So I commend our staff at 250 and putting this together in other sessions like this. I can't thank you enough. Joe is really that good looking. I want you all to know that. I'm looking at his picture there, and he is. But we are really honored and really lucky to have Joe and the team that he has also assembled and brought to our organization. They're very talented, but also Joe heading up the 9/11 Memorial and Museum and other projects that he's done. He has brought a level of professionalism and skill set that we now have. And I know we're going to have this wonderful commemoration as we lead up to 2026. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you both. So I'm going to share now a recording from Rabbi Mira Rivera, who was unfortunately unable to join us in person, but was very happy to send this along. So,
gathering today is an act of spiritual resistance. We defy those who would try to divide us and confound us. Coming to this table, we resist those who mock us and fetishize us. In coming to this table, we defy those who hate, humiliate, and perpetuate criminal atrocities on our people. We do not apologize for being Asian, American, Pacific Islanders living in these United States of America. I, for one, am a minority within this minority, an Asian, a woman, and a Jew. I serve as a rabbi, a teacher, and a board-certified chaplain in Jewish institutions like Romemu, Amud, the Jews of Color Torah Academy, and I learn and I support my siblings at Lunar, the Asian Jewish Film Project. Now, Asian, Jewish, female, that cold towel has been slapped on my face. Yet, in Judaism, I resonate with the story of the Exodus, the plight from servitude from a land of narrowisms. And my own Asian and Spanish heritage is bursting with Exodus stories. We have crisscrossed turbulent waters, the Pacific and yes, the Atlantic, in a relentless diaspora. So today, I know before whom I stand. As I stand here, I taste the sea salt of ancestral tears. I stand and I caress the red knuckles of the women in my family in my own hand. I know before whom I stand, the reinvention of my father, a Filipino manong, an elder, who was an 18-year-old swabbed Dex, but who would emerge into full, honorable adulthood, into Menschlichkeit, we say in Yiddish, and who would send so many to higher education and learning. But is the America of my parents different from the America today? I wonder. But what I know is I would grab hold of that cold towel when it is slapped on my face. There will be no more muzzles of model silent suffering here. This gathering today of Asian American, Pacific Islanders, family we are, is an act of spiritual resistance, and we defy all those who would divide us and confound us.
Thank you to all of our introductory speakers. I'm going to, Congresswoman Meng, I know, is on a tight schedule, so I'm going to turn it over to Michael Glickman to begin the conversation.
Thanks so much, Megan. And thank you everyone for being here. When we think about a panel and a conversation, there's really, this is the gold standard of what we could have hoped for. And so I'm really quite delighted and grateful that we have the opportunity to bring three incredible leaders and thought leaders and doers and folks who are in the field really helping to change society. So I'm going to start with you, Congresswoman Meng, because I personally and professionally have been inspired by what you have done as a non-Jewish member of Congress who has championed the fight against anti-Semitism. And so, one, thank you for that. We want to make sure that we recognize that that role and responsibility. Recent reports tell us that 1 in 4 Jews in this country have been the subject of anti-Semitism over the past year, and that anti-Asian incidents have increased 77% since 2019. With both the Asian and Jewish communities in this country experiencing dramatic increases in hate-related incidents, what more can we be doing and what more should we be doing?
Sure. First of all, I don't want to take up too much time thanking everyone because I'd be on for a while, but really grateful for this opportunity. And I really do think it's conversations like these that need to be happening more and more. Sometimes in diverse cities like New York, where we have vibrant communities within our own neighborhoods, geographically or culturally, we don't take advantage of the communities that sometimes exist right next to us. And it's really these conversations that have to happen and where we will see real progress. So I'm so excited to be here today. And you're right, you know, these cases, incidents, bias incidents and hate crimes have increased exponentially against both of our communities, especially in the last few years. However, we probably don't even know the full picture. There are too many law enforcement jurisdictions that don't even collect or report sufficient data. And so we don't technically know what's happening and where, unless there happens to be reports or a video that happens to go viral. And we know that there's so many in our communities who are either too scared to report them or who don't believe that any action, constructive action will be taken if they do report them. And so one piece of legislation that actually I think today's the 1-year anniversary of my COVID-19 hate crimes bill that was signed into law last year. This was done in large collaboration, not just within the Asian community, but with many other communities, including the Jewish American community across the country. And it basically included provisions that will create a better and more effective infrastructure and oversight of reporting these types of incidents to ensure that we can even begin and adequately measure what's actually going on the ground so we can have better responses. We're also working with the DOJ to stand up the grants that were authorized to create state-run hate crimes reporting hotlines, as well as incentivizing local law enforcement to actually report these crimes to the FBI. I was really proud as New York's senior appropriator on our appropriations committee to help secure $250 million for a program called the Nonprofit Security Grant Program. And that literally goes towards helping to help our houses of worship and nonprofits on fortifying their physical infrastructure to make our communities and all of our congregants safer. And so these are just some of the ways, but the conversations that we're having are so important and such an important first step.
Thank you. So when we look at the Jewish and Chinese communities, for instance, we've seen that they've lived side by side for generations, thinking particularly of places like New York City, but also elsewhere. These stories rarely get looked at together. And I'm wondering if any of you want to dive in and discuss the connections between these communities. And maybe while we're doing that, we're going to put up a slide that Annie might take us through, looking at some images from the garment industry, sort of as you all are diving into that question.
So I'm happy to start. It's an honor to be here. And again, I can't wait to say it's an honor to be here and have all of us be here in one real place together. But for the meantime, this is still very nice. I will talk about the garment industry. One thing I want to say, though, Michael, you're absolutely right that the lower Manhattan has been a place where the Chinese community and the Jewish community, immigrant Jews and immigrant Chinese, have come for many years. But it's important to note the Chinese Exclusion Act, which stopped the arrival of Chinese immigrants and the real growth of the neighborhood. So when our tenement was built in 1863, you start to have the growth of a German neighborhood, and later an East European Jewish neighborhood, an Italian neighborhood. And those communities could grow unfettered by immigration laws. But the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act stops the growth of the Chinese immigrant community. And that's not going to change again until 1965. So even though this has been a place where both Jews and Chinese have come to settle, it's been very difficult to for the Chinese community to grow until we get to the 20th century, although there's still important, very, very important beginning foundations in the 19th century. But I just wanted to kind of put that out there before we do that comparison to acknowledge that difference. Both immigrant Jews from Eastern Europe and also later Chinese Americans worked in the garment industry. And one thing we found in the Tenement Museum is the way in which the garment industry serves to connect one group to another. And in other words, every group, whether Italian, whether German, whether Puerto Rican migrants, many people had families who worked in these garment homes, and those types of garment shops change over time, but they all are kind of becoming part of the New York economy. And I think at the Tenement Museum, the exhibit I'm most proud of is one where we recreated a Chinese garment shop. And we're able to, in the sewing machines, when you touch a sewing machine, you hear the voices of the women and you see the films of the women telling their own story of what it was like to work in the garment shop and what it meant to them, what the union was like, and all of that. So there are so many stories stitched in to the fabric of our neighborhood and the fabric of the clothes that we've worn for so long. And so to be able to kind of dig into those stories is so important. So at the museum, it's been nice to tell those stories side by side and understand both the challenges and opportunities that different groups have had.
Nancy?
Yeah, just adding to that, and I'm grateful, echoing everyone's sentiment around being in this conversation. I love what Congressman Meng has shared, and Annie as well. And I just want to compliment some of those thoughts and notions to sort of suggest that, you know, having been a product of Kew Garden Hills, Flushing, you know, Grace knows it well. So born and raised in Flushing in an Orthodox Jewish neighborhood, I was the person who put the bikes away. I was the person who shut off the electricity when everyone forgot on the Sabbath. And, you know, I thought I was going to marry Yossi and live happily ever after. He moved back to Israel, and that didn't happen. But I've always lived, surprisingly, in Jewish and Chinese neighborhoods. And I've actually been very curious about that on a qualitative, sort of anecdotal basis. And, you know, Woodbridge, Connecticut is another community that is heavily populated, Jewish and Chinese American, and a very growing population of Asian Americans. Kew Garden Hills, of course, on the Lower East Side, of course. And I think what's interesting is, this might sound trite, but this is something that I've heard over and over again in the oral histories that we've taken down is, oh, the Jewish community and the Chinese American community have a lot of things in common, right? This is very sort of subjective. They both prioritize education. They both respect their elders. There's a level of restraint. I've heard that word used as well before, that we manage and do things in our own way. And what I find interesting about some of the Chinese American attributes in terms of the cultural and the building of community is that Confucian ideal. That was also, you know, pre-Cultural Revolution, but the Confucian ideal of protecting the home, protecting the family, and having that filial piety to respect elders. And I think there are a lot of similarities. And when you have similar traits and similar respect for neighborhood and space, that actually draws you, you know, like-minded individuals into those spaces. What's interesting that I find that for Chinatowns in particular, there are three really anchors to the faith-based communities among Chinese Americans: Transfiguration Church, Chinese Baptist, and also Protestant Christian Church. And the faith-based component among also many Jewish communities, with the temple being quite the root of these communities, also has some similarities. And, you know, it's so interesting having really the privilege of serving at the museum to see so many of these stories kind of develop side by side. And I would, you know, I'd like to also add on to Annie's point that the infrastructure, I'd like to sort of suggest it in a different way. Even though there was an Exclusion Act from 1882, slightly repealed in 43, the Hart-Celler Act, and then 1965, the Johnson's Immigration and Nationality Act. But what you did see was actually a real urgency, because citizenships were stripped away, to create infrastructure in those communities. So what I really love about the story between 1882 and 1943 in particular is a formation of very important groups like the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association. Many of us probably know it better as CCBA, that really house a lot of these social services, a lot of access points to try to understand how to make some sort of life in a country that discriminated so much against them. And I think I'll leave it on that one last note: the discrimination that we all dealt with, anti-Semitism, anti-Chinese sentiment. And I think that also gave some sort of familiarity with the kind of life one was desiring in this country, and yet wasn't really fully able to realize.
Thank you. When we think about infrastructure, I want to pivot for just a quick moment and think about it from the standpoint of culture. For those of us based in New York, we have the benefit of being able to engage with different ethnicities and different cultures. From a Jewish perspective, we're really quite fortunate that we have a national Jewish museum in the Weitzman, based in Philadelphia. Congresswoman Meng, you have championed a national institution that is on the heels of getting configured and thought through for Asian American Pacific Islander experience. I just wonder if you can touch upon that for a moment, and then we have a question from the audience as well, where we're going to stay with you for that.
Sure. Actually, Michael, your timing is perfect, and you're the first people I'm sharing this with. But our bill to create a potential AAPI museum in Washington, D.C., it had passed the House a few weeks ago, and just a few hours ago, it passed the Senate. And so it's literally on its way to the White House. So I'm very hopeful, especially in this month of AAPI month. And we're just trying to make sure that our future generations, because it might take that long, our future generations of both Americans and people from around the world will be able to learn the more diverse parts of the different communities that have contributed to American history and what makes us such a great country. And so we're really excited, and I think it's just important to be able to learn each other's histories. And we often see that we have so much more in common than we have different from each other, and that's kind of cliche. But I think it's really important too, and I'm really excited. And hopefully conversations and exhibits, even about our two communities and how what we're talking about today and how we've coexisted, hopefully will be a part of that museum one day too.
Well, mazel tov on that. I'm going to turn it over to Megan, who's going to jump in with a community question.
Yes, congratulations. That's great news. That's excellent. We've got a question, Congresswoman Meng, from folks in the audience asking for a link to the fund that you spoke about to fortify places of worship. Is that something the community project funding?
So that's different.
Okay.
This is called the Nonprofit Security Grant, and I or my staff, Judith is on it. My team member just put the link on the website.
Amazing, thank you.
On the chat, sorry.
Great. And then we've got another question here. Yesterday, in a discussion in the hospitality industry with API CEOs of hospitality companies like hotels, they talked about model minorities, and yes, as Ms. Yao says, the discrimination. Each thing they said, I heard my non-Asian Jewish family saying, what are the similarities and differences?
Maybe Annie, you want to jump in there?
Sorry, what was the exact question?
The model minorities, the similarities and differences
between the Jewish and Asian communities.
Right.
In terms of the stereotypes, how to compare those, or the actual?
Why don't we
share a little bit from the Chinese Americans' perspective?
Yeah.
So in 1982, the cover of a Time magazine article suggested that 4 young Asian American kids were, classified as model minorities. Obviously, any stereotype, whether negative or positive, is still a stereotype. And I was actually a little bit perturbed. I'm very forthcoming and just say kind of, what's on my mind. But Elon Musk recently, I think it was last night, tweeted out something that said, oh, Chinese workers are really much better because they work until 3 a.m. They're good workers. And again, really interesting, because a lot of people be like, oh, he's saying that Chinese workers are good workers. And that's a positive seeming, but again, some sort of generalization and stereotype. There are so many problems with positive stereotypes, individuals not being able to live up to it, scapegoating, and having one model minority group. Then if there's one model minority, there's one that's several that are not models. And therefore, creating that tension within marginalized groups and populations is a very, very dangerous place to be. And it's left to those groups to sort of work it out and create understanding amongst one another. So living under that, and that tension also, that really goes into the family, around the kitchen table, around the dining room table. Why aren't you the model minority like your cousin Brenda? Why aren't you like your friend? And then there's something wrong here, and all that internal tension that builds and crescendos, and then take it out of that dining room setting, it goes more and more into other groups. So extremely dangerous to have this. And I can only speak from the many, many stories that we've collected from Asian Americans and specifically Chinese Americans in this space.
So Congresswoman Meng, I know that we have a hard stop with you. I just wonder if you'd like to add a parting word, and we'll continue the conversation from there.
Yeah, this is actually a conversation that's come up a lot, especially as we go from generation to generation, right? Like that first wave of recent immigration from Asian American families, for example, you know, they sometimes want those success stories, right? But we, like people, you know, like Nancy and I, who are trying to help as many people on the ground, some people who don't necessarily have their voices represented when policies are being made, we need to make sure that the most vulnerable in our community are being, their stories are being told too. And that's why we talk a lot about statistics and data, for example. You know, I remember when I first got elected to the state legislature, I had asked the city for more support for mental health services for the Korean American community. And they said, well, nobody calls our hotline. You know, I don't think they need any help. And so we said, well, that's because you don't have language access. Like if someone who only spoke Korean called your hotline, they would not be able to communicate with you. So it's like a chicken and the egg. You know, we need to make sure that we are telling the stories of our diverse AAPI community. It's not a monolith, and that's true of the Jewish community, at least in my district in Queens. We have third generation Jewish Americans who are living in Queens. And then we also have newer immigrants, Bukharian Jews, for example, who have different issues, language access, for example. So we need to make sure that we are sharing as wide of a story, the picture as possible. And thank you for having me. I'm sorry to leave early, but I look forward to working with all of you. Some of you I'm meeting for the first time, and please don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
And I can add a little bit just in terms of, you know, the importance of looking at numbers, the importance of looking at statistics to understand the diversity of any community. I think one of the programs that we work a lot with school children is a Your Story, Our Story program where students write stories of their own migration or immigration story in their own family, and they tell a very individual story. And I think the more we understand people's individual stories and the complexities of those stories, the better understanding and the more connections we're able to make, as opposed to thinking about stereotypes, even if they're stereotypes that are considered with positive quality.
So when we think about what gets done in a place like the Tenement Museum, or what gets done in the Museum of Chinese in America, what is most important, I shouldn't say most important, but an important aspect is having people come into an institution and see themselves represented in a way that speaks to their experience. So I wonder if you all could kind of dive in there a little bit and talk about the importance of having the Jewish American and the Asian American and Pacific Islander experience represented in cultural institutions, and being exposed to those experiences in ways that school children might not otherwise see, or visitors to New York might not otherwise see. So maybe Nancy, you could start us off on that.
And I'd love to. And these are such good questions. I'm really enjoying it. A lot of people come to the Museum of Chinese America and they kind of think that they'll see a certain Chinese artifact or antiquity or a Chinese vase or a porcelain, you know, XYZ or a scroll or calligraphy. And when we tell them that we're a US History Museum, they're really confused. And I think it's that bridge, the inability to somehow make my face American enough. And I think we struggle with that constantly, that phrase perpetual foreigner lives and breathes in the Asian American Pacific Islander population. And I think what we try to do very much is meet people where they are. The conversation is so layered, and he's alluded to this, it's so nuanced, so layered, so complex. If I'd like to suggest that the Chinese American population in this country is one of the most diverse populations, consider the last 80, 100 years of history. Different political regimes that people are sourced from, different educational backgrounds, different socioeconomic backgrounds, different dialects. Everything is different. China itself has gone through 3 different political regimes, not even considering the Chinese diaspora that left in 1949 after the Civil War, who went to Jamaica. If anyone's tried Cuban Chinese food, guess how that happened? Because of exclusion. and who went to Sao Paulo, Brazil, Montreal, Toronto, South Africa, Mauritius. The diaspora was created because Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, and people couldn't reconnect with their families. So I think what we really have to just say is, let there be space with all this layered and nuance. And the word Chinese is not in the mission of the Museum of Chinese in America. We want every single person who comes through MoCA to have a greater sense of the possibility of the American narrative as we try to broaden it. So MoCA's contribution is, maybe you'll get some stories about some interesting, stories around some of the early immigrants and the things that maybe they were, dealing with day to day, but also you'll have a greater sense of yourself. That's what we want to do. And, I think we always then encourage people to go to the Center for Jewish History, go to Student Museum in Harlem, go to Japanese American National Museum, go to Wing Luke in Seattle, go to the Tenement Museum. Because the more, echoing Annie's comment, the more we understand the diversity and that there's not one monolith for any type of person, the closer we are to realizing the true possibility of the American dream.
Amen. I will say to that. And, in terms of diversity within the Jewish community, I have to bring up that anecdote that's told all the time about finding a man on a deserted island, and he had been on the island for many years, and he had built 2 synagogues, and they said, why do you have 2 synagogues? And so there's one that I go to and there's one I will never go to. Like, just this idea that even in one person there can be so many different ideas, and so representing the Jewish experience in one way is really impossible. And at the Tenement Museum, it's interesting. We have an apartment that tells the story of a German Jewish woman, another one, an East European Jewish family, a Sephardic Jewish family, a Jewish family that survived the Holocaust and came to create a new life. And then those stories are told in tandem with Chinese stories, Italian stories, non-Jewish German stories. So it's being able to kind of look at those stories, both for their own particular what they're bringing to the table, but then also kind of understanding the relationships between the different groups that came to share space at various moments in one neighborhood and ultimately in one country. And I think the best thing that can happen at the museum, and it's happened, I love when you're giving a tour, and everyone experiences the museum on a tour. So you can't just walk around on your own. And I think that's part of that's just as important as the building. It's just as important as the real stories we tell, is that people are coming together in community in one space to ask questions and to learn together, which is something we don't have that opportunity that much anymore, especially adults once you're done with school. And so to be able to kind of learn about someone's grandmother, someone from Kansas's history is so interesting. And what will happen on a tour sometimes is someone will say after the tour, I always thought history was boring. I thought history was about textbooks. I thought history was about generals or battlefields or, legislature, which all those things are interesting. I'm not downplaying them, but I never knew that a story that took place in a kitchen, just like my grandmother's or my aunt's, could be history, right? And so I think being able to have people understand that their stories are part of history, whether that particular family lived in a tenement or not, is kind of not even the point. Just the idea that ordinary lives, family history is part of understanding American history more broadly. That's something that we strive for.
Thank you. Megan, back to you for some public questions.
We've got a couple of questions. A question is about, is Angel Island one of the few museums to tell the stories of Asian American immigration? But I would like to also sort of expand that question to also talk about what is the landscape of museums that address the Jewish American experience, and are there museums that bring those together in meaningful ways?
Yeah, and I can take the Angel Island Immigration. That is a nonprofit. It is a museum. And about 90% of the immigrants who went through Angel Island, which is the West Coast, you can take a really nice boat trip from the San Francisco Bay Area and head over there. Unfortunately, it's extremely inaccessible. So if I could win Powerball tomorrow, the first thing I would do is create a dock that has the ferry go directly to Angel Island. And I'm not even joking. I do that before I did anything for MoCA. I give the rest to MoCA, but still. And then, so 90%, and they're predominantly young boys, 12, 13, 14 years old. This is entirely around the period where there was a lot of paper sons and paper daughters. Won't go into all of this directly, but 1906 earthquake, San Francisco, enterprising Chinese selling false papers to young boys who were trying to leave China and create some sort of opportunity in the new America. So many of those 90% of the folks who went through there were young boys. And so it's actually the largest Chinese American wave that came through. And that is a distinction I definitely want to make on this call, and I would feel inadequate if I didn't highlight it. The Trump administration in March 13th, 2020 called it the foreign virus. A couple of days later, as he said, the Kung flu. A couple of days later, he obviously referred Chinese virus. He didn't say it was an AAPI flu, right? He didn't say it was an AAPI virus. So in some ways, thinking a little bit about the positive minority myth, but also thinking a little bit about how we sort of broaden a little bit to make a collective label or topic, I think sometimes is always also quite dangerous. So I love the idea of having a collective voice because I think that is empowering. But at the same time, I worry that that doesn't dilute necessarily the individual stories. The AAPI community is incredibly diverse. And for us to try to understand, it's taken the Chinese, the MoCA 42 years to try to think through this narrative. The reason so much of the Chinese anything and the basis of discrimination is so very much rooted in exclusion is because the Chinese American population makes up the largest population of AAPIs. So 24 million AAPIs in this country, Chinese Americans make up about 4 or 5% of that. That's why it's, oh, everyone must be Chinese, everyone must look alike, because they think they look Chinese. And I think we have to be really clear. And that's why one of the solutions that we're long on is that let's get this exclusion, that massive period of history that has manifested itself in all of this hate and discrimination. Let's understand that fully. It's kind of like the internment of Japanese Americans. That is a marker in history that we need to understand. And yes, there's a collective voice in the AAPI, absolutely. But let's not do it at the expense of some of the stories that we need to understand. The Holocaust, Japanese internment, and the Exclusion Act. Those are fundamental parts of history that are not properly told in our history textbooks.
Annie, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I just 100% that the importance of understanding complicated history, the importance of avoiding history that's just about kind of glorifying the past is to really what can be most helpful is to learn about moments in US history we might not be proud of, so that we can create a better country, because there are many things we want to be proud of in this country, and then at the same time there are many things that we don't, and to avoid that is perilous. In terms of, I think there had been a question about the landscape of American Jewish museums. So just, of course, a shout out to the museum in Philadelphia, which tells the story of hundreds of years of Jewish life in the United States from a variety of perspectives. And I think that's a very important museum, in part because it's telling history that happens here on American soil. And in addition, there's a lot of stories, a lot of museums that are dedicated to Holocaust, which is incredibly important because it's something we need to remember. But I guess if I was able to add something to that landscape, I would have more museums as well that tell the story of Jewish life in America, so that we learn those complexities. And I think that will help us with this current issue that we have today. Not current, it's a long-running issue, but has come into focus more and was brought up earlier, of anti-Semitism. Like, let's understand how anti-Semitism played out in the 19th century, in the 18th century, and the 20th century here, which could be in more subtle ways than other forms of racism, but are also important for us to kind of understand so that we can be comparing narratives and understanding how everything comes together. So I guess my wish here is for more museums, more complex history.
And I'll take a moment to maybe do a shout out to the museums, which is, certainly for those folks who are in Philadelphia or passing Philadelphia, go and visit the Weitzman National Museum of American Jewish History. They've just reopened with some wonderful new exhibitions, and you'll have an opportunity to really experience the full breadth of over 368 years of Jewish life in this country. And when you're in New York, of course, going between the Tenement Museum and the Museum of Chinese in America, you're going to have this incredibly rich and wonderful and varied experience. And as a New Yorker and as a culture hound, I'm thrilled, Nancy, that you all are building a new museum, and we can't wait. I think I speak for everybody when we say we can't wait to see how that takes shape and how that comes together. I want to also just put one plug in for Jewish American Heritage Month, which the Weitzman has organized and has brought together over 125 different institutions around the country, creating an opportunity to introduce Jewish life in this country, American Jewish experience, to millions of Americans. And it's so very important. And so just thrilled to be able to carry that message alongside AAPI month and to find those commonalities. I want to dive into the next question, which is, as we reflect on 250 years since the signing of the Declaration of Independence, what are your hopes? It could be personal, professional, whatever it may be, for America's future for 2026 and beyond. You want to start with that, Annie? No pressure.
Many hopes. I hope that we become a more united country through the understanding of each other.
Nancy?
Our systems are frail. And I think people on this call understand how frail they are. And we hear every day how the fringe has become mainstream. And I do agree wholeheartedly with Annie that museums need to be those access points for education, because it'll take a long time for our textbooks to change. And so I hope out there that there can be funding, that all museums that do this type of work, that tell these stories, that aren't beating ourselves on the chest to say it's our time or it's our headline. Not at all. I think we're all in solidarity around the fact that we know these stories, as objectively as they are presented, can really help reach the ideals of the foundation of this country.
Terrific. Megan, I'm going to pass it back over to you. I know we might have a question or two from the community and want to make sure we have a chance to do that.
We sure do. So we've got some folks attending whose experience has, in their life experience, have not really run across Jewish community or a Asian American Pacific Islander community. So they're learning lots of new things, and I think that's fantastic. I think it's just a testament to having these conversations and people being interested and experiencing things that might be outside their comfort zone. So that's awesome. We do have a question. Can you discuss the critical importance of oral interviews in adding to this rich history, and what are your museum's roles in supporting those efforts?
I think oral history is incredibly important. The museum, when the Tenement Museum got started in the late 1980s, and there were articles starting to be written about it, one woman, a Brooklyn woman, saw an article and said, "Oh, that's where I lived. That's what was my tenement." And she showed up at the Tenement Museum, Josephine Baldizzi Esposito, and they said, "Oh my goodness, you're the Messiah. Tell us your story." And they recorded her story, and her stories, and they recorded her multiple times, helped inform the creation of her family's apartment. And I just had the experience about a month ago where her daughter came. Josephine has since passed away, but her daughter came with her granddaughter, who had never met her great-grandmother, and could hear that and could hear her voice. And so the oral histories lend so much subtlety, and they get at something that academics on their own don't quite get at. So if we think about the way that the academia is structured, you'll have Jewish studies, and you'll have API, Asian studies, and you'll have, Latinx studies, like all of these different kinds of subsets. But of course, people don't live in vacuums. They don't live in sections. Their lives have been about interactions. And often it's through those oral histories where people will talk about their day-to-day lives that you see these interactions. And I think that's key and that's critical. So for example, a woman talked about growing up who lived at 97 Orchard, one of our tenements, and she and her sister were friends with two Chinese sisters who lived down the block, and that told the stories of going to their house for food because they liked the food more, but then the Chinese girls liked her mother's latkes. Like these stories are really important. They're not just cute stories, right? They're stories about how people forged connections as they forged their daily lives. And so I think, again, that's just one way that we've used oral histories, and that oral histories help us shed light on so many issues and really shine the spotlight on people who wouldn't otherwise necessarily be part of traditional histories.
And I echo everything Annie said about the formal oral history. And we've taken well over 2,500. They can be found on our website, on our oral history metadata synchronizer. But beyond that, I think we'd really like to teach the skills for children to talk to their parents, for grandparents to talk to their grandchildren. And I think that that's incredibly important when you're coming from an immigrant neighborhood, immigrant community, immigrant family, where there's a natural disconnect. You did not have the same upbringing. And that tightness may not be the same. I struggle with that in my own family. And I marvel every day as I raise my teenagers, how much more connectivity we have than my parents had. We had a quiet connectivity. I still speak Chinese, but it was different. And I think oral histories are powerful for social history to really give that candor and that color, but it also is in terms of really building a stronger foundation for personal relationships that we have, in this country.
I would add the power of storytelling is amplified by having the voices and the experiences of those who are represented in our museums, in our places of culture and the like. And it helps introduce new ideas and new cultures to people who would not otherwise have that experience.
And Michael, may I add something? Because I also think that if the museum takes down the oral history of a given family or individual, it's almost like I'm reminded of Emile Beauchamp, the very well-known photojournalist. And he took these incredible photographs are in our collection, over 200,000 photographs. He took the photos of everyday life of Chinese Americans. He saw something that I would never take that photo. And I think also for museums, for the role of us to take and have those interviews is a very powerful vehicle that is able to get to a different type of conversation. And also it goes and adds into this woven narrative that we get to witness and are privileged to every day. But it might not be obvious if I'm talking to my mother or my child. And I think that that's the other powerful part, thinking so much about someone who really did do something remarkable for both the Jewish community and the Chinese American community.
Those are beautiful pictures.
Oh, amazing.
And I just to add another thing, because I agree with Michael also too about storytelling. That's how we learn. We don't learn memorizing facts. We don't learn, on a multiple choice test. We learn and we remember stories. So that is key. And so the other thing I found is that when you can connect a story to a space, you're able to bring people in an immersive space, that experience stays with them. So to kind of bring the conversation full circle, we started looking at a garment shop. In our garment shop, we have the sewing machines, and then again, you touch them and you hear the voices, you see the women who worked on those sewing machines. And so that connection of their story in a kind of the recreated space has such a really powerful impact. So the more, whatever it is, the story that you're trying to tell, creating immersive spaces for people, I think, is another great learning tool.
Before I pass this back over to Megan to close us out, I just want to say it really is a privilege. And this audience has had the opportunity to hear from two remarkable individuals who are leading important institutions in this country and helping to continue the conversation. And I think that's what today is about. And that is what all of us who work in this space are focused on, continuing the conversation.
And you can visit MoCA and the Tenement Museum. And between those two institutions are like the best restaurants and
Yes.
like the world.
We were
it
saying the
feels
same
like-
thing. Yeah.
So back to tourism, back to New York City, and back to every other community in this country. And Megan, back to you.
Sure, thank you. This has been fantastic. We continue to get questions in the chat. Clearly, we will need to have a part 2 of this at some point. Always great to have such remarkable folks to have these conversations. I want to thank our speakers and panelists for being here, our ASL folks. Michael Glickman, thank you. Dan Samuels, I know you're hiding in the background there. Thank you for helping to wrangle this. Thank you so much to all of the folks in attendance. Your questions and comments have been very insightful and helpful. We want to continue the conversation. Please contact us at engage@america250.org. And my colleague Mari has put a survey in the chat so that we can continue to improve your experience. Thank you again, everyone, so much for this amazing conversation.
Thank you.